Okay, yeah, good. It is my privilege to deliver this for you. Whiteness, what is it? Where did it come from? And why does it matter? I mean, the main focus of what I'm presenting will be the British, Caribbean, American experience, because there are the strong links with slavery and racism between the three. But of course, there are people here from Canada and other parts of the world. It'd be good to hear their perspective as well. I think there may be some parallels. So I hope that you'll be sharing later with us on what the perspectives are elsewhere. Robert Baird, writing for the Guardian newspaper in 2021, wrote, "Before the 17th century, people did not think of themselves as belonging to something called the white race. But once the idea was invented, it quickly began to reshape the modern world. And so it did, resulting in those with white skin holding a position of privilege on every continent on Earth on the basis of their skin color." And I should start by acknowledging that this isn't my work. It is the work of the authors of color who have written about whiteness and its effects. So the credit belongs to them, particularly William Henry, the Reverend Otis Moss III, Otecha Uwagba, and there are others as well. So, and I think their plea is that we don't just increase our knowledge and understanding about what whiteness has done to people of color, only to give us an advantage, but then do nothing to change the harm that it has done to them. So the aim is not to make you feel guilty about being white. The hope is that we will not exploit our whiteness at the expense of people of color, and we do all we can to undo the harm that it has done. So whiteness, what is it? In short, it is that white people have made all things white and beautiful. Here are some definitions. It is the philosophy and psychology of assumed European, American, racial, cultural, economic, spiritual superiority and privilege. John Curran describes it as a form of conscious and unconscious power that exists within a collective psyche and also within the individual self. It is a way of thinking which is embodied within white people as the flagship of normality and moral consciousness. Therefore, whiteness is imperialism. And he goes on, "Yet I find it hard to relinquish it because it offers me too much of my identity that I cannot let go," which is an interesting point. Sister Panyin describes whiteness as a perceived notion of an universal standard for which all good things are judged, is based on a lie supported by ideological propaganda, stroke warfare, for which there appears to be no escape. And Paul Ayufumi Grant describes it as a social construct created by the group who have cloaked themselves in this identity to forge group identity and loyalty as a catalyst for their ongoing psychopathic, racially motivated wars of imperialism. Whiteness has been constructed as the superior antithesis of blackness, which it seeks to degrade. Whiteness sucks Africans into an identity based on color, the pigment alone, and seeks to divert us from the platform of land, history, culture, upon which Africanness, the best antidote to whiteness, for us rests. So it disempowers non-whites to accept the superiority of Europeans. It draws people of color into an identity based on skin color alone. It erases, denies, and reinvents the past to make the present vision of racial harmony and pluralism more plausible. But where did it come from? Some archaeology in this country found that the genetic makeup of the oldest human bones found in Britain shows that he may have had dark or black skin. And an excavation in England of a 7th century family grave contained the body of a black African girl. Now, people had different complexions, language, and cultures depending on where they were found, but they did not think in terms of race. The word white or black as separate races to describe people was not part of the vocabulary until the 17th century. So how did it begin? A white terror. The native Caribbeans were enslaved very quickly by Europeans when they discovered the islands. The word slave derives from the word Slav. The Slavic people of Eastern Europe were enslaved by all sorts of people, including Western Europeans, for centuries. Slavery was not about race because no one had thought it up yet. Ibrahim Kendi's 2017 book, Stamped from the Beginning, traces systemic racism to the 1440s, when the Portuguese began to trade exclusively in African bodies, and Prince Henry of Portugal and his chronicler, Gomes de Zurara, were the first to justify slavery as salvation, as opposed to enriching themselves from slavery. They denigrated Africans with negative qualities that would justify Prince Henry's Catholic mission to the world. They declared Africans to be a lost race of people, living like beasts without any custom of reasonable beings. They had no understanding of good, but only knew how to live in bestial sloth. Terrible, isn't it? In 1562, English trader, pirate and explorer John Hawkins replaced native Caribbean populations reduced by war, enslavement, and disease with slaves from West Africa. In Virginia in 1619, a Dutch pirate ship arrived with African slaves captured on a Spanish vessel. Virginia had no slaves and no laws regarding slaves. Growing tobacco, the chief cash crop of the colony, was done by contracted indentured labor from England arriving in 1607. They were worked like slaves, but they were not slaves for life. After 4 to 7 years, they were promised freedom, a suit, corn, and a parcel of land. But in the harsh conditions, only 2,000 survived out of the first 15,000 who had arrived in 1607. So the need for agricultural skills meant that anyone, regardless of skin color, was welcome. And early African settlers acquired and farmed land and could prosper as free people in Virginia. They were comparable in class with the indentured English laborers. Colonists referred to themselves as English or Irish or other European ethnicity, but did not think of themselves as white. The Africans joined the indentured laborers in their struggle against the landowners who often disregarded their contracts and wouldn't free the indentured laborers from their condition. The landowners responded by offering English laborers a status well below landowner but above the Africans. And in 1639, Virginia enacted laws stripping away legal rights from people of color and creating the status of slave. Only they would be slaves for life, and new privileges were given to European laborers. In 1663, a law made every non-European child legally a slave owned by the mother's owner. So this legal racial contract permitted the seizure of the land and property of people of color and allowed their wealth to be stolen from them. This was the start of whiteness. It empowered whiteness to take people of color away from their land, their culture, language, and history, take away their identity, their status, and impose on them lives controlled by their owner, given a name chosen by their owner, not as a sign of adoption, but as a sign of ownership. told who they could marry or couple with, and what happened to their children. They could be sold on and families separated at the owner's whim and be punished for even the slightest infractions, whipped, raped, branded, and killed. To justify the traffic in human flesh, white people created the myth that black skin was a curse. Black Africans, a race that was physically strong but infantile, who needed to be controlled by Europeans. The uncomfortable truth that they came from highly accomplished, technologically innovative civilizations with sophisticated political systems and cultures was erased. Africa became the dark continent, its people devoid of civilizations and their cultures and spirituality classified as heathen, to be tamed, civilized, and exploited by rapacious Europeans. Whiteness then became a form of oppression. White superiority and privilege prevailed. Enslaved people were declared only 3/5 human, and their accomplishments and prosperity was an affront met with exploitation, looting, and destruction. It became known as Mafa in Swahili, a word meaning disaster or terrible occurrence or great tragedy. It was the African Holocaust. So why does it matter? Whiteness matters because it has colored and shaped the world and invaded all aspects of the experience of people of color. The resulting injustices have never been fully addressed and continue to have disastrous effect on people of color and their relationship with white people. Whiteness in the Black imagination is often a representation of terror. So what's in a name? Slave name identity. For persons with African slave heritage, their family names are a traumatic reminder that their identity has been obliterated and all the references of their lives are seen through the prism of that white light, culture, language, history, and religion. Kant, who was the father of 18th century enlightened European philosophy, declared that to be black was to be stupid and never presented anything great in art or science or anything praiseworthy. In his System Natural, Linnaeus, another Enlightenment giant called the Prince of Botanists, attached race to each of 4 regions of the world and color-coded races as white, yellow, red, and black. He described their characteristics, which race makers still follow. At the top, with superior characteristics, was, of course, Homo sapiens europaeus, described as vigorous, muscular, very smart, and inventive, ruled by law. But at the very bottom was Homo sapiens afa, African, in other words, with the least desirable characteristics: black, kinky hair, sluggish, lazy, crafty, slow, careless, capricious. And this was the way that Europeans then came to see people of color. But there is no evidence for these pseudoscientific or falsely Darwinian notions of inherent superiority or inferiority between races. The criminalization of blackness. After emancipation in the United States, there was a brief period when people of color were elected to state and federal legislatures, and they were given some means to prosper. This gave way soon to the Jim Crow laws, when these rights were eroded and taken away. Jim Crow laws, named after a black minstrel show character, legalized racial segregation and denied African Americans the right to vote, hold jobs, get an education or other opportunities. Attempts to defy them faced arrest, fines, jail, violence, or death by lynching. In the 1968 Civil Rights Acts restored civil rights to people of colour under the Constitution. Critical race theory was developed in academic circles to explore the way that these civil rights continued to be denied them by obstructions placed in the way of their implementation. For example, voting rights were eroded by attempts to impose onerous ID qualifications, hindering voter registration, and disqualifications due to minor errors in registration forms, the gerrymandering of districts, the limiting of the number of ballot stations, creating long voter queues, where even giving water to people waiting to vote was denied in order to deter them. So for Black people, they were denied, or people of colour, they were denied access to competent legal representation, and they developed their own legal services to defend their rights. Men of colour were jailed for minor misdemeanors in huge numbers, and whose labour was to be exploited as a new form of slavery, with prisoners farmed out to work, and as a means of disenfranchising them. A modern version is the 3 strikes law, where someone, mostly males of colour, were given long sentences after committing 3 minor offences, way beyond the severity of the offence itself or the risk the offender posed. Men of colour were viewed with distrust and suspicion, attacked and killed for being in the wrong place. Stand your ground is the legal defence in many states for shooting people of colour who just happen to be in the wrong place or knocking on the wrong door. In the United States and Britain, there is still unequal treatment in the criminal justice system, and people of colour are still brutalised by the police. This is particularly apparent when arrests are made in volatile situations, or when a person, often with mental health problems, is being arrested, and the situation is mishandled and escalates into violent response, and sometimes with the death of the person being arrested. A recent report by Lady Casey declares that the English police service is still institutionally racist. And she also comments on the continued racism within British society. So the prosperity of people of colour was often seen as an affront to whites and eyed with jealousy and suspicion and hindered or destroyed. This happened in Tulsa in 1921, when white people rioted and sacked and attacked a prosperous Black community in Tulsa, leading to many deaths and the destruction of property and businesses owned by people of colour. So we come to the Windrush generation and the experience of immigrants from the Commonwealth. British subjects, but not like us. The Windrush generation, named after the passenger ship that brought the first settlers from the Caribbean to the UK, was invited by the government to help rebuild post-war Britain due to a labour shortage. And although they were British subjects, the cultural, religious, political and social sensibilities that they took for granted had a rude awakening. They were not seen as one of us by white English society. It was symptomatic of the way that post-colonial settlement kept Black British subjects in subjection to whites, with the blanket of whiteness thrown over them. Finding work and suitable accommodation was a nightmare. Despite their level of education and qualifications, the jobs that they were offered were Black jobs with limited social mobility, paid less than their white counterparts, and promotion was restricted. They were living in a hostile, racist society. They were seen as a threat to whiteness, taking our jobs, taking our homes, taking our women, diluting our gene pool, expected to conform to white culture and social norms, and vilified as lazy, loud, immoral if they didn't. They exposed the prejudices and crimes of the past that were hidden and sanitized as glorious empire and white colonial achievement, and what it meant to be civilized. Whiteness defined normality. It reinforced a not one of us mentality. Unless they won an Olympic gold medal, then they were one of us, draped in the Union flag. Sports people of color were seen for their physical prowess, in the same way that black slaves were seen as beasts of burden. And then, as Adrian has said, 2 generations later, the Windrush settlers, confronted by rigid, unsympathetic, and bureaucratic immigration and nationality system, faced discrimination and loss of settled status, and promised compensation to many has been delayed. People of color have been misunderstood. They face discrimination in social services, health services, education, employment, and housing. People of color have to measure up to white values as British values and a white idealized version of what it means to be British. They're seen as a problem when they riot against police brutality, and they're held up as a cause for society's ills and blamed for not fitting in. Men of color are condemned for not meeting normal white social standards and are judged as feckless single fathers, blamed for dysfunctional families, forgetting that for 400 years, whites routinely raped women of color, forced enslaved couples apart, separated their children from them on a whim. But despite limited education and employment opportunities and poor housing, black families have developed and survived in this hostile social economic environment. And white people readily appropriate the music, fashions of people of color and then call it their own. Seeing through white lens, head decay shun. Entrusted to a school system that reinforced a British social class system, reinforcing and social stereotypes prevalent in all aspects of British society, children of colour were lumped in with low achieving working class manual labour and treated with contempt by their white teachers. They were not encouraged to think away from Eurocentric world intellectually, and they were made to feel that they did not belong. If they complained, they were seen as disruptive and were often excluded. The work of students of colour was often marked more harshly. It was education on white man's terms. Whiteness was rightness, and children of colour came to despise what they experienced in school. Education became what William Henry describes as head decay shun. Those who control the state schooling system in Britain and the United States are not about to alter the misinformation inculcated through their schools. Schooling of this kind is needed to reinforce the cultural values and beliefs and maintain the existing power relations. These cultural values and beliefs have historically undermined the integrity of Africans, while at the same time justifying African oppression. Library has become library in the terminology of William Henry. School reading lists enforce a white reading of history, culture, and literature, and all things British, and books too black were not included. And we can see that the US is gripped by a feverish attempt by parents and legislators to control what is taught in school about slavery and the history of people of color and their treatment, and the censoring of books contained in school libraries. Books are banned. Misrepresentation of critical race theory is used as a catalyst to reassert white direction of what is taught and teachers of colour are vilified, harassed, or fired for not conforming to the white agenda. So speak no evil, see no evil, hear no evil. The reality of the past has to be neutered, glossed over, seen in a positive light, acceptable to white sensibilities. And there's a whitewashing of history, lessons taught in school eulogizing the empire and emphasizing white, British, European, and American achievement. Black history has become limited to Black History Month and focuses on what white people would consider to be good people of colour. People like, for example, Olaudah Equiano, Mary Seacole, Martin Luther King. So white roots in blackness. A school of thought argues that the name Africa didn't originate with them and was given to the continent by the ancient Greeks and Romans. In his Kemetic History of Africa, Dr. Sheikh Anna Diop writes, the ancient name for Africa was Al-Kebulan. It is the oldest and the only word of indigenous origin. It means Mother of Mankind or Garden of Eden, and the Garden of Eden is reputed to have been in Botswana. It's generally acknowledged that Homo sapiens walked out of Africa and colonized the world. What's in our genes? An Armenian academic study into their genetic origins found that more than 50% of their genetic markers had their origins in Central Africa. So race is not a biological fact. It is a lie. There is no gene for race. So recovering our human identity. Tensions within British society still wrestle with what it wants. Assimilation, people of colour to be one of us, or right to be different, not one of us. People of colour know what separates them from whites and generally unites whites against them. They realise this is a problem in a racist society. They have come to know their strengths, understand the world in which they live, and position themselves to strive. The respect agenda within sports and bow the knee is the one prominent area with a specific anti-racist focus. In Britain, we are raised and conditioned by the institutions that enforce our values. Our royal family, the Church of England, our schools, the police and the army. What we don't see are the scars on the backs of those who had been enslaved and their stolen heritage and mutilated identity, whose ancestors are part of our society. Our institutions have no intention of changing because white people have too much invested in keeping things as they are. To enjoy the privilege of being human, people of colour participate in white-dominated institutions they have grown to despise. They become ideal candidates because they don't really change anything. So love your neighbour. Christianity was weaponized as a tool of control. In whose image? Africa was the cradle of humanity. Adam and Eve were Africans, so whites blamed people of colour for the fall. Blackness became a curse and legitimized the punishment inflicted upon them for causing sin to come into the world. So white man said, let us create God in our image. So in our image, we created him. And white male, we made him. So historically constructed images of Jesus Christ as white enforced whiteness colonizing the consciousness of people of color. Whiteness assaulted justice and love in a society that regarded itself as Christian. Slavery was justified as biblical. Church and ministers persuaded themselves that a group of human beings made as they were in the image of God were created to be slaves, owned by them. White theology dominates their Christian faith. But the reading of the Bible by people of colour proved to be subversive. It was their source of resistance, undermining and dismantling the slave trade and ownership of slaves. They developed a theology of their own with struggle, justice, and equality at the heart of it. Robert Beckford's 1998 book, Jesus is Dread, reappraises Jesus as black with balls and highlights the foundation of the Christian faith given by North African early church fathers. Only a handful of European bishops attended the early church councils that established the orthodoxy of the Christian faith. White people, and I've experienced this when I visit a black church, are often held in higher regard than people of colour in church. Black Lives Matter has instigated a long overdue, hard discussion about the hurt that people of colour have experienced in church and how Christians, white and people of colour, relate to each other and how they are represented in church power structures. So justice demands. People of colour are reluctant to participate in civil society and call themselves English, when the expectation is that they would never be equal partners at the top levels of society. International trading imbalances have produced instability, poverty, death, disease, and civil strife, with huge numbers of Africans risking their lives to migrate to Europe, creating an unimaginable humanitarian crisis. We are coming to you because you are rich and you have made us poor. They look to white people for salvation because the institutions that regulate international relations and trade are set up by whites and dominate the agenda in favor of the rich West. White people solving black people's problems is an acceptable way of knowing about them while misrepresenting and distorting the narratives and experience which ignore the Black Holocaust. Under the 1833 Wilberforce Act that freed slaves, slave owners were compensated, but the freed slaves received nothing and continued in poverty and exploitation. Whiteness remains in force because of the reluctance of those who benefit from it to confess their crimes, unable or unwilling to let it go. It makes justice and the idea of reparations all but impossible. Never mind apologizing. After all, it's all in the past. We didn't do it. It's not our problem. It's too difficult or too costly, even if we can identify who the reparations should apply to and how. Now, whites outside the US view the murder of people of color in the US by the police or by white people as something that happens over there, and things are different here. Whereas people of color here see that what is happening there is happening to them as part of a collective consciousness. Hence the rapid explosion of Black Lives Matter in response to the killings of people of color by white people. Whiteness' potential to kill and destroy leads people of color to self-harm, culturally, politically, economically. But despite all of this, people of color have developed a resilience to resist their own cultural death and racial suicide. Now, it is reported that King Charles has commissioned research into the royal family's involvement in slavery, smarting, I think, from the hostile reception that Prince William and Kate had on their visit to the Caribbean. Now, I hope that it does not simply result in an apology or some symbolic act of contrition, but opens up this real debate and discussion about the need for reparations. So, conclusion then, whiteness reinforces a racist version of the truth and people of color as white man's burden, dispossessed and disenfranchised, seen as inferior, less intelligent and suspect, forced to exist in the margins of society, creating for themselves an economy that exists outside of the norm because often they have been denied a fair and equal part in white-dominated economic structures. Whiteness disempowers non-whites who are schooled in the acceptance of the superiority of Europeans. Institutionalized ignorance ensures people of color know nothing of themselves or the achievements of pre-chattel slavery Africa. The 8% whites enforce a Eurocentric worldview on the rest. In the Amazon series, which is really about race, in Carnival Row, Millworthy, one of the main characters there, says, so what defines us? Is it our skin, soil, status, or our strife? Our lives are shaped by the hand of power. Our fate and future are balanced on his knife. His blade cuts both sweet and sour. Seems we've no choice of skin, soil, or strife, but do we not all tread the same dark earth? Sleep neath the same blanket of night? Do we not all love, laugh, grieve, and have worth? Well, the truth is, our path is ours to define, because our own flesh and blood will make their own line. And to finish, there is this quote from Haile Selassie, who said, throughout history, it has been the inaction of those who could have acted, the indifference of those who should have known better, the silence of the voice of justice when it mattered most, that has made it possible for evil to triumph. So thank you for listening. I'm going to hand over to Adrian.
Ray, thank you so much. I just know the amount of work that you put into that, researching for this presentation, and thank you just for the richness of the data and information that you've given us.
Thank you.